My name is Dana Whitfield, and I was 38 the day my boss handed me a cardboard box and a severance letter and told me the company was going in a different direction. 12 years. I'd given that company 12 years, 3 departments and a system nobody else understood because I was the only one who'd ever bothered to build it. He smiled when he said it. He actually smiled. He had no idea that by Friday, the different direction he'd chosen would run his entire operation straight into a wall, because the wall was made of everything only I knew how to fix. Welcome back to Her Silent Triumph, where we tell quiet stories about the women who got underestimated, overlooked and pushed aside, right before the moment they stopped being invisible. If you've ever been the one who held everything together while someone else took the credit, you're exactly where you need to be tonight. Drop a comment and hit subscribe because this one is worth staying for. Let me take you back to the beginning, because you have to understand what 12 years actually looks like before you can understand what it means to lose it in 4 minutes. I started at Callaway Freight Solutions when I was 26. Back then, it was a regional trucking and logistics outfit with 11 employees and a single rented office above a tire shop in Ohio. The owner, Richard Callaway, had inherited it from his father, who'd built it out of 2 trucks and a stubborn streak. Richard was 31 when I met him, loud, charming in the way men are charming when they've never had to be anything else, and completely uninterested in the parts of the business that didn't involve handshakes and golf. I was hired as an administrative assistant. That was the title on my offer letter. Answer phones, file paperwork, keep the calendar. Within 6 months I was doing dispatch because the dispatcher quit and nobody else wanted the headache. Within a year I was doing billing because the billing software was a disaster nobody could read but me. Within 2 years I had quietly built, on my own time with my own notes, because nobody asked me to, a tracking system that told us in real time which trucks were where, which loads were late, and which clients were about to walk. Nobody called it a system back then. I called it my spreadsheet. Richard called it Dana's thing. But by year 3, every single person in that office, including Richard, was opening Dana's thing before they opened their email. I want to be clear about something because I think it matters to how the rest of this lands. I never asked for credit. I never went to Richard and said, "I built the backbone of this company, give me a title." I told myself that doing excellent work quietly was its own kind of dignity. I told myself the work would speak for itself eventually. I believed that for a very long time. It took me most of those 12 years to understand that work only speaks for itself to people who are willing to listen. And Richard Callaway had never once in his life been willing to listen to anyone who wasn't billing him by the hour or pouring his drink. The company grew. 11 employees became 40, 40 became 90. We expanded into 3 states. And every single expansion ran through the system I'd built, refined, and rebuilt 3 times as the company outgrew each version. I was the one who negotiated with the software vendor when our old tracking platform broke down during a snowstorm and we nearly lost our biggest client. I was the one who trained every new dispatcher, every new billing clerk, every new ops manager who came through that door, because Richard hired fast and trained never. My title changed twice over 12 years. Administrative assistant became office manager, became eventually director of operations. My salary changed too, though never quite as fast as my responsibilities did. I told myself that was fine. I told myself a lot of things were fine. I should tell you about Marcus Callaway here, because Marcus matters to how this story ends, even though for most of it he's barely in the room. Marcus was Richard's son, 24 when he first started showing up at the office on weekends, sitting quietly in the corner of the warehouse with a laptop, asking me more questions in a single Saturday than his father had asked me in 5 years. He wasn't being groomed for anything yet. He was just curious, and curiosity is a rare thing to find in that family. I answered his questions because that's who I am, and because nobody else seemed interested in giving him real answers. I didn't think much of it at the time. I had no idea I was building something that would matter later. I just liked that anyone, in that building wanted to understand how the engine actually worked instead of just driving the car. The years moved the way years do when you're useful. Fast in hindsight, slow in the living of them. I missed my cousin's wedding because of a system outage during peak season. I worked through 2 Christmases because year-end reconciliation didn't care what day it was. I turned down a job offer from a competitor in year 7, better pay, better title, because Richard sat across from me at his desk, looked me dead in the eye and said, "Dana, I don't know what we'd do without you. You're the reason this place runs." I believed him. I want you to sit with that for a second because I believed him completely, and I built the next 5 years of my life on top of that sentence. Here's the thing about being indispensable to someone who has never once had to be indispensable to anyone. They start to resent you for it without even noticing they're doing it. Richard never said it out loud. He didn't have to. It showed up in small ways. The way he'd introduce me to new clients as my office manager instead of by my actual title, even after the promotion. The way he'd take credit in client meetings for systems I'd built single-handedly, nodding along like he'd designed them himself, while I sat 2 seats down saying nothing, because saying something would have meant making a scene over a sentence, and I had never once in my life wanted to be the woman who made a scene over a sentence. I want to pause here and tell you about the morning everything started to shift, because it didn't shift all at once. It shifted the way ice shifts on a lake, quietly underneath, long before the crack ever reaches the surface. It was 18 months before I lost my job. Richard had started talking about retirement, about handing the company to Marcus, who was 29 by then, and had spent the last several years actually learning the business in a way his father never had. I was glad. I liked Marcus. I'd trained him myself in 100 small ways nobody else noticed, and I thought naively that his stepping in would mean things finally got easier for me. I thought it meant someone who actually understood what I did was about to be in charge. I didn't know yet that Richard had brought in a consultant. His name was Greg Bannerman, and he showed up on a Tuesday in a suit that cost more than my first car, talking about operational efficiency and scalable systems and modernizing legacy processes. Legacy processes. That's what he called the system I'd built from nothing, refined 3 times and run flawlessly for a decade. He said it the way you'd describe a fax machine. Richard hired him to do what he called an organizational assessment before handing the reins to Marcus, and from the very first week, Greg made it clear that he saw me as exactly one thing: a cost center that happened to know too much. I should have seen it coming faster than I did. I didn't because I genuinely believed after 12 years that the work would protect me. I want to tell you that's not naive. That's just what happens when you've spent over a decade being told, directly and indirectly, that you're the reason everything works. You start to believe that reason is a kind of armor. It isn't. It never was. Reason doesn't protect you from a man with a clipboard and a quarterly target. Greg's assessment took 4 months. In that time he interviewed almost everyone in the company except me, which I noticed and tried not to read too much into. He sat in on meetings and took notes I never saw. He asked Richard pointed questions about redundancy and succession risk, which is corporate language for what happens to a company if the one person who understands everything gets hit by a bus, or, as it turned out, gets handed a cardboard box. The thing nobody in that building understood, not Richard, not Greg, not even Marcus yet, was that I hadn't just built a system. I'd built the only working map of how Callaway Freight actually functioned. Not the org chart. Not the official process documents, which were years out of date and which I'd stopped bothering to update because nobody read them anyway. I mean the real map, which clients needed to be called personally before invoices went out or they'd dispute everything out of habit, which drivers needed to be scheduled around which other drivers because of old grudges nobody had ever resolved, which vendor contracts had handshake side agreements that existed nowhere on paper, because Richard had made them himself over lunch 15 years ago, and then promptly forgotten the details, leaving me to remember them for him. That map lived in exactly one place, my head, and in a series of files on my personal laptop that I had, out of pure habit and a decade of being burned by bad backups, never fully synced to the company servers. I want to be honest about something here, because I think it's the most important decision I made in this entire story. and I made it almost 2 years before I knew I'd need it. About 20 months before I was fired, our IT contractor, a kid named Theo who I'd trained almost as much as I'd trained Marcus, sat me down after a server crash that nearly wiped out 6 weeks of billing records. We'd recovered it barely, after a brutal weekend. Theo looked at me afterward and said very plainly, "Dana, if you ever leave this company on good terms or bad terms, everything you know walks out the door with you, and there's no version of this business that survives that gap." He wasn't being dramatic. He was being an engineer. He was describing a single point of failure, and the single point of failure was me. So I did something quiet. I didn't tell Richard. I didn't make an announcement. I simply started documenting everything properly the way it should have been documented for the company's sake all along, except I built it as my own private, dated, time-stamped record, stored in a personal cloud account under my own name, completely separate from any company system. Every process, every client quirk, every vendor-side deal Richard had ever mentioned to me in passing that existed nowhere else. Every password to every system that I, and only I, had full administrative access to, because over the years, one by one, those administrative responsibilities had quietly landed on my desk, and nobody had ever bothered to take them back. I didn't do it out of suspicion. I want to be clear about that, because I've thought about this a lot since, and I don't think I was being paranoid. I think some deep, tired part of me had simply stopped believing that loyalty was going to be repaid in kind, and had decided that if nobody else was going to protect the value of 12 years of my life, I would. That decision is the entire reason this story has the ending it has. Everything else was just waiting to happen. Greg Bannerman's assessment finished in March. I found out what it actually said 3 weeks before I was fired, and not from Richard. I found out from Marcus. Marcus came to my office on a Thursday evening after everyone else had gone home. He looked like a man carrying something he didn't want to be carrying. He sat down across from my desk, the same desk I'd sat at for 12 years, and he said, "Dana, I need to tell you something, and I need you to know I fought this." He told me Greg's report had recommended what it called operational restructuring, which meant eliminating my position and redistributing my responsibilities across 3 newly created roles, each filled by someone with a fancier title and a fraction of my actual knowledge. The justification, written in language so bloodless it almost made me laugh when Marcus read it to me, was that my role had become too centralized and represented an unsustainable concentration of institutional knowledge in a single non-executive position. Translation: I knew too much, I'd been paid too little for knowing it for too long, and now that the company was finally profitable enough to look attractive to investors, my title and my salary line looked, on a spreadsheet, like a problem to be solved rather than a person to be valued. Marcus told me he'd pushed back. He told me he'd told his father this was a mistake, that I was the only person who actually understood how the company functioned end to end, that firing me without a transition plan was operationally reckless. He told me Richard had listened, nodded, and then done exactly what Greg recommended anyway, because Richard had never in his life made a decision based on what was true when there was an easier decision available based on what was comfortable. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I asked Marcus the only question that mattered to me in that moment. Did your father know I built the entire client retention system from scratch? Did he know I'm the only person with the master vendor contract notes? Does he understand what happens to this company on a Monday morning if I'm not the one answering the phone? Marcus looked at me, and he said something I've turned over in my head many times since. I don't think he's ever once asked himself that question, Dana. I don't think it's occurred to him that the answer might be bad. I didn't cry that night. I want you to know that because I think it matters. I went home, I made dinner, and I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, and I went through my own private files, the ones Theo's warning had pushed me to build almost 2 years earlier, and I made sure every single piece of it was current, dated, and complete. I wasn't plotting revenge. I want to be honest about that. I was simply, finally, doing for myself what I had spent 12 years doing for a company that had just decided I was disposable. The firing itself happened on a Monday morning in April, 3 weeks after Marcus warned me. Richard called me into his office at 9:15. Greg Bannerman was already sitting there, a folder squared neatly on his lap like a man who enjoyed this part of his job a little too much. Richard didn't make eye contact for the first 30 seconds. That told me everything before he said a single word. "Dana," he said, "we've been doing some restructuring, and unfortunately your position has been eliminated effective today. This isn't about your performance. We just need to take the company in a different direction." A different direction. 12 years, distilled into 4 words by a man who'd never once had to learn what my job actually involved. He slid a folder across the desk. Severance, 2 weeks per year of service, which sounded generous until you did the math on 12 years of being underpaid relative to what I actually did, and a release agreement they wanted me to sign that day on the spot, before I'd even had time to process that I no longer had a job. There was a box already sitting by the door, my name written on it in someone else's handwriting, which meant they'd packed up my desk before they'd even told me I was fired. I sat there and looked at that box for a long moment, and something in me went very quiet and very still, the way it does right before you stop being afraid of a thing. I didn't sign anything that day. I told them I needed to review it with an attorney, which is my right, and which made Richard's jaw tighten in a way I'd seen exactly twice before in 12 years, both times right before he lost a major client because he refused to listen to advice he didn't want to hear. Greg started to say something about timelines, and I simply stood up, picked up my box and walked out. I didn't slam the door. I didn't say a word to anyone on my way out, though half the office had clearly already heard, because half the office wouldn't meet my eyes. I drove home with the box in my passenger seat, and I want to tell you honestly that the thing sitting heaviest in my chest wasn't anger yet. It was grief. 12 years is a long time to give to a place, and even when that place fails to give it back, some part of you still mourns it like a death. I let myself feel that the whole drive home. I didn't fight it. I think you have to let yourself feel the loss honestly before you can do anything useful with what comes after. And I'd learned a long time ago that swallowing grief just turns it into something uglier later. But by the time I pulled into my driveway, something else had started to settle in alongside the grief. A clean, cold clarity. Because I knew something Richard Calloway did not know yet, something Greg Bannerman's tidy little restructuring report hadn't accounted for at all. I was the only person in that company who had full administrative credentials to our client-facing tracking platform, the system I'd built and rebuilt 3 times over 12 years. I was the only person with the actual current vendor contract details, not the outdated paper agreements in the filing cabinet, but the real terms, the side deals, the personal arrangements Richard had made over lunches and handshakes, and never once written down. I was the only person who knew which of our biggest clients required a personal call before their invoice went out each month, because of a billing dispute from 6 years earlier that nobody else even remembered existed. I was the only person who knew the actual login credentials to 4 separate vendor portals, because I'd set them up myself using my personal email as the recovery address. A detail nobody had ever thought to ask about because nobody had ever thought to ask about anything. And none of that knowledge had left with a transition plan. None of it had been handed off. Greg Bannerman's restructuring report had eliminated my position and redistributed my responsibilities on paper to 3 people who had never once touched the actual systems, because nobody had ever actually documented those systems anywhere except in my head, and as of 20 months earlier, in my own private files. I didn't go back to sabotage anything. I want to be completely clear about that, because there's a version of this story where the wronged woman goes back and deletes things, breaks things, burns the place down out of spite, and that is not who I am and it is not what I did. I didn't touch a single company system after I walked out that door. I didn't need to. I simply went home, and I waited, because I knew with absolute certainty what Monday morning was going to look like without me there to hold the seams together, and I knew nobody had bothered to ask me how to do it themselves. The first call came Wednesday morning, 2 days after I was fired. It was from one of the new hires Greg's restructuring had installed, a woman named Priya who'd been given the title of Client Relations Manager, and absolutely none of the institutional knowledge required to actually do the job. She sounded frantic. One of our largest clients, a regional distributor we'd worked with for 9 years, had received an invoice with the wrong rate structure applied, because the special pricing arrangement we'd had with them since a contract dispute in year 4 existed nowhere except in my head, and the new billing system had defaulted to standard rates. The client was furious. Priya didn't even know there was a special arrangement to begin with. I was polite. I told her I was no longer with the company and that she'd need to speak with Richard or Greg about it. I felt no satisfaction in that moment, and I want you to believe me about that, because some part of me still cared about the people left behind in that building who hadn't done anything to deserve the mess they were about to inherit. But I also wasn't going to volunteer 12 years of unpaid expertise to a company that had handed me a box and a 4-word explanation 3 days earlier. By Friday, the calls had multiplied. A driver scheduling conflict that I would have caught and resolved without anyone even noticing, because I'd known for years that 2 of our long-haul drivers had a personal history that made certain route pairings a disaster, blew up into an actual confrontation at a loading dock that delayed 2 shipments by a full day. Vendor whose contract renewal I would have flagged 8 weeks ahead of time, because I tracked every single contract date in a spreadsheet nobody else had ever asked to see, quietly let the contract lapse, and Callaway Freight lost preferred pricing on fuel that had taken me 3 years to negotiate in the first place. Nobody had thought to ask where that spreadsheet lived. Nobody had thought to ask, period, because for 12 years, asking had never been necessary. I'd simply handled it. I heard about all of this secondhand, through Theo, the IT contractor, who texted me that Friday night just to check in, because he was a decent person, and because I think some part of him felt guilty for the warning he'd given me almost 2 years earlier that had turned out to be so precisely correct. He told me the office had been, in his words, a slow-motion car crash all week. He told me Richard had spent most of Thursday on the phone with the angry distributor client, trying to explain a pricing structure he himself had never fully understood, because I'd always been the one who handled it. I didn't gloat. I want to be honest with you about that because I think the temptation to gloat is exactly the trap that turns a quiet, earned reckoning into something pettier and less powerful. I simply let it happen. I went on with my week. I updated my resume. I called my attorney, a woman named Carolyn Reyes whom a former colleague had recommended, and I sat down with her to go through that severance and release agreement Richard had wanted me to sign on the spot. Carolyn read through it carefully, the way attorneys do, and then she looked up at me and asked a question that changed the entire shape of what came next. Dana, she said, in 12 years, did you ever sign anything assigning your work product, your documentation, or your personal records to the company? Anything that would give them ownership over materials you created and stored independently? I told her no. I'd never signed an IP assignment agreement because in 12 years nobody at Callaway Freight Solutions had ever once thought to draft one for an administrative assistant who'd quietly become the operational backbone of the entire business. There had never been an employment contract with restrictive covenants because Richard Callaway had never operated with that kind of formality. There was an offer letter from 12 years earlier outlining a starting salary and basic at-will employment terms, and that was it. That was the entire legal relationship. Carolyn sat back in her chair and said something I'll remember for the rest of my life. Then every piece of independent documentation you created on your own time, on your own equipment, under your own name, belongs to you, not them. I want to pause here and explain something, because I think it's important to understand what that actually meant in practice, and why it mattered so much more than it might sound like on the surface. It didn't mean I owned the company's client list, or its financial records, or anything that had ever lived on Callaway's own servers under Callaway's own name. It meant something much more specific, and as it turned out, much more dangerous to them. It meant the years of operational knowledge I had voluntarily, independently organized into my own private files. The vendor-side deals nobody else had written down, the client quirks that existed nowhere in any official document, the entire unofficial map of how that company actually ran day to day, none of that had ever legally belonged to Callaway Freight Solutions. It had only ever lived in my head, and then, because I'd been careful, in files that were mine. Carolyn's advice was simple, and I followed it precisely. We didn't threaten anyone. We didn't send a single demand letter. We didn't have to. She told me, "Dana, you don't need to do anything aggressive here. You need to do nothing at all and let them come to understand the value of what they lost on their own. That's worth more than any letter I could write." So that's exactly what I did. Nothing, I let the silence speak. The following Monday, 10 days after I'd been fired, Richard Callaway called me himself for the first time. I almost didn't answer. I sat looking at his name on my phone screen for a long moment, feeling that same cold clarity from the drive home settle back over me, and then I picked up, because I wanted to hear in his own voice exactly how far the cracks had spread. "Dana," he said, and his voice had a strain in it I'd genuinely never heard from him before, not once in 12 years, not even during the snowstorm crisis, not even when we nearly lost our biggest client in year 5. "We've got a situation here. I need to ask you a few questions about the Meridian account." Meridian was the distributor client whose pricing had gone wrong the first week. I let a silence sit on the line for a moment, not out of cruelty, but because I genuinely didn't know yet what I wanted to say, and I'd learned a long time ago that you should never speak before you know that. "Richard," I said finally, "I'm not employed by Callaway Freight Solutions anymore. I can't discuss client account details. You'll need to direct that to whoever's handling client relations now." "Dana, come on." His voice shifted into the tone I recognized from 12 years of watching him handle people he wanted something from, warm and a little wounded, like I was the one being unreasonable. "We've known each other a long time. I'm not asking you to come back to work for free. I just need to understand what happened with their pricing structure so I can fix it." "I genuinely don't know what to tell you," I said, and this part was true. That pricing structure existed because of an agreement we made with them after the 2019 billing dispute. I don't know who has access to those notes now, because I never had a successor, and there was never a transition plan put in place before my position was eliminated. There was a long pause on the line. I could hear him breathing, and I could hear underneath it the particular kind of silence that happens when a man is doing math he should have done 2 months earlier. "There's no transition plan," he said slowly, more to himself than to me. "No," I said, "there wasn't time for one. I was let go the same day I was told." He didn't have a response to that, because there wasn't one to have. I told him I hoped things worked out, which was true in the limited, distant way that you hope a storm passes quickly even when you're not standing in its path anymore, and I ended the call. I want to tell you what happened over the following 3 weeks, because this is the part of the story where the slow-motion crash Theo had described to me stopped being slow. Callaway Freight Solutions lost the Meridian account entirely in week 3. Not because of the pricing error alone, but because the pricing error revealed to Meridian's leadership that nobody at Callaway actually understood the terms of their own 9-year-old contract, and that erosion of confidence, once it started, didn't stop. Meridian had been roughly 11% of annual revenue. I knew that number because I was the one who'd tracked it, every quarter, for years, in a spreadsheet that, as far as I knew, no longer existed anywhere the new hires could find it. The fuel vendor contract that lapsed without renewal cost them their preferred pricing tier, which I estimated, based on volume I'd tracked for 3 years, would add somewhere in the range of $40,000 to $60,000 annually in increased fuel costs. Nobody had caught it in time because nobody had thought to ask where the renewal calendar lived, and the answer again was, in my head and in files that belonged to me. 2 of the senior drivers, the ones with the old personal conflict I'd quietly managed for years through careful scheduling, ended up in an actual physical altercation at a depot after weeks of being scheduled together by dispatchers who had no idea there was history between them. One of them quit. The other was suspended pending an HR review that, as far as I could tell from what Theo told me, the company didn't even have a real process for conducting, because that too had always quietly run through me. And underneath all of it, the thing that I think actually broke Richard Calloway, more than any single lost contract or any single angry client call, was simpler and quieter than any of that. It was the slow, grinding realization, contract by contract, client by client, crisis by crisis, that the entire architecture of a business he had run for over a decade had never actually existed on paper at all. It had existed in a woman he'd just handed a cardboard box to, a woman he'd called to her face, my office manager, for years even after she'd been promoted past that title twice, a woman whose work he'd taken credit for in client meetings while she sat 2 seats down saying nothing. Marcus called me at the start of week 4. I'd been wondering when he would. "Dana," he said, "I need to be honest with you about something, and I need to ask you for something, and I want you to know up front that I understand if the answer is no." I told him to go ahead. He told me his father had finally, fully grasped the scope of what had happened, not because Richard was capable of admitting fault easily, but because the numbers had made it impossible to avoid any longer. Meridian was gone. The fuel contract was a mess. 2 other mid-sized clients were making noise about service disruptions that, again, traced back to coordination that used to happen invisibly through me. Marcus told me the board, because Calloway Freight had, in preparation for the transition to Marcus, recently brought on 2 outside advisors as a kind of informal board. A detail I hadn't known until that call, had started asking pointed, uncomfortable questions about what exactly Greg Bannerman's restructuring had actually accomplished, beyond eliminating a single salary line, and in the process, very nearly the entire institutional memory of the company. "I fought for you before this happened and I lost," Marcus said. "I'm not asking you to forgive my father, I'm asking if you'd be willing to talk on your terms about what it would take to fix this, not as an employee, as whatever you want it to be." I sat with that for a long moment before I answered, because I wanted to be sure I wasn't speaking out of anger, and I wasn't speaking out of some quiet hunger for vindication either, even though I'd be lying if I said no part of me felt something close to it. I was speaking, when I finally did speak, out of exactly the same thing that had carried me through 12 years in that building in the first place. A basic, stubborn belief that good work deserves to be valued honestly, and that I was done pretending otherwise just to make someone else comfortable. "I'll talk," I said, "but I'm not coming back as an employee, Marcus, not after this. And I'm not doing this for free, and I'm not doing it quietly behind your father's back the way I did everything else for 12 years. If we talk with everyone in the room, including him, and including whatever this board now looks like." Marcus agreed without hesitation. The meeting happened 2 weeks later, in the same conference room where 18 months earlier, Greg Bannerman had first sat down with his clipboard and his language about legacy processes. I want to tell you honestly that I almost didn't go. I sat in my car in the parking lot for several long minutes beforehand, looking up at that building, feeling the old familiar pull of 12 years tugging at me, and I had to remind myself deliberately that I was not walking back in there as the woman who'd once needed Richard Calloway's approval to feel like her work mattered. I was walking in as a consultant with an attorney's advice in her back pocket and a folder of her own. Richard was already seated when I walked in, along with Marcus, the 2 outside advisors I hadn't met before, a sharp-eyed woman named Vanessa Seelho and a quieter man named Thomas Park, and notably no Greg Bannerman. I learned later that Greg's contract had quietly not been renewed once the board started asking why his operational efficiency recommendations had cost the company an 11% revenue client and tens of thousands in fuel pricing within a single quarter. Richard stood up when I walked in. He'd aged in 2 months in a way that surprised me, the particular kind of agging that comes from sleepless nights rather than calendar years. He didn't try to charm me the way he might have a year earlier. He simply said, "Dana, thank you for coming," and waited for me to sit before he sat down himself, which was, in 12 years, something I'd never once seen him do for anyone in that office, including clients. I want to tell you about the next 90 minutes carefully, because I think this is the part of the story people actually want, and I think it deserves to be told the way it actually happened, which is to say, quietly, without theatrics, the way real reckonings almost always are. Vanessa Seelho opened by laying out, plainly and without much editorializing, what the board's review had found. She had pulled financial reports from before and after my departure. She walked through the Meridian loss, the fuel contract lapse, the driver incident and its associated costs, 3 separate smaller client complaints about response times that had previously never taken more than a few hours to resolve and were now taking days because nobody knew who was supposed to own them. She put a number on the table, a conservative estimate of the financial impact of those 8 weeks, and the number was larger than I had expected, large enough that Richard visibly flinched when she said it out loud. "This isn't a story about one bad consultant's recommendation," Vanessa said. "This is a story about a company that built its entire operational core around one person for 12 years, never documented it, never compensated her in line with the actual value she was generating, and then eliminated her position based on a report that fundamentally misunderstood what she did. I want to be direct about that, because I think everyone in this room needs to hear it stated plainly before we talk about what happens next." I didn't say anything yet. I let it land the way Carolyn had taught me to let silence land, because the truth, stated plainly by someone other than me, carries a different weight than the same truth coming from the person it happened to. People can dismiss a wronged woman's account as bitterness. It is much harder to dismiss the same account when it's delivered by a financial advisor with a spreadsheet. Richard finally spoke, and to his credit, what he said wasn't an excuse, though it took him a long moment to get there. "I never asked what would happen if you weren't here," he said. "In 12 years I never once asked that question. I told myself you'd always be here, and I think some part of me resented that I needed you to be." He looked at me directly for the first time since I'd walked in. "That's not your fault. I want to say that clearly. It was mine." I appreciated that he said it. I want to be honest about that, because I think there's a version of this story where the apology never comes, and the woman walks away anyway, and that version is its own kind of victory, just a colder one. I was grateful, in a tired and complicated way, that I didn't have to settle for the cold version. But gratitude for an apology and trust in a relationship are 2 very different currencies. And I'd learned that the hard way over 12 years of believing one sentence from a man who'd said it once and then quietly built an entire restructuring plan that ignored everything it implied. "I'm glad you understand that now," I said, "but I want to be clear about why I'm here. I'm not here for an apology, and I'm not here to take my old job back. I'm here because Marcus asked me to talk about what it would take to fix this, and I'm willing to do that, but only on terms that reflect what actually happened, not terms that paper over it." Thomas Park, who'd been quiet up to that point, leaned forward and asked the question I think the entire room had been waiting for someone to ask. "What would those terms look like, Ms. Whitfield?" I had thought about this carefully in the 2 weeks since Marcus's call, with Carolyn's guidance, and I laid it out plainly, the same way Vanessa had laid out her numbers. First, I would not return as an employee under any circumstances, full-time or part-time, salaried or otherwise. That door was closed permanently, and I wanted it understood as closed before anything else was discussed. Second, I was willing to engage as an independent consultant, on a defined, limited engagement, for the specific purpose of documenting the operational systems that had never been properly recorded, but at a consulting rate that reflected the actual market value of that expertise, not the salary I'd been paid as an employee for over a decade, which Carolyn had helped me benchmark, and which was, frankly, multiples higher than my old paycheck had ever been. Third, any documentation I produced during that engagement would be created under a clear, written work-for-hire agreement, specifying exactly what the company would own and what would remain mine, reviewed by my own attorney before a single word was written. because I was never again going to leave the value of my work undefined and unprotected. Fourth, and this part mattered most to me, the engagement would include a real transition plan. Not a redistribution of responsibilities to people without the underlying knowledge to handle them, but an actual structured handoff, with my direct input into who within the company was capable of absorbing which pieces of institutional knowledge, so that what happened to me with no warning and no documentation could never happen to whoever came after. I watched Richard's face while I said all of this, and I want to tell you that what I saw there wasn't anger. I think a year earlier it would have been. I think a year earlier Richard Calloway would have bristled at being told terms by the woman he'd handed a cardboard box to, would have found some way to make it about loyalty or gratitude or 12 years of history that I supposedly owed him something for. But the numbers Vanessa had put on the table had done something to him that no conversation alone ever could have. They had made the abstract concrete. They had turned Dana's thing into a line item large enough to threaten the company's standing with its own board. "That seems fair," he said quietly, "more than fair, honestly." We signed the engagement agreement 11 days later, after Carolyn had reviewed every line of it twice. The consulting rate, annualized, came out to nearly double what my old salary had been for roughly a third of the hours. I want you to sit with that number for a moment, because I think it says everything about 12 years that no single sentence could. I spent the next 4 months documenting everything. Not the way Greg Bannerman's report had imagined documentation, a tidy org chart redistributing tasks across new titles, but the real architecture. Every client quirk, every vendor-side arrangement, every scheduling conflict and personal history between drivers that needed managing, every password, every login, every piece of institutional memory that had lived only in my head for over a decade. I built it properly this time, with the company's full cooperation, into systems that would survive me, because that had always been the right way to do it, and it had simply never occurred to anyone to ask me to until losing me had cost them enough to make the question unavoidable. Marcus took over as president 8 months after I was fired, once Richard formally stepped back. One of his first decisions, made publicly in front of the whole staff, was to create a permanent senior operations role, properly titled, properly compensated, with explicit documentation requirements built into the job description from day one, specifically so that the company would never again allow a single person's knowledge to become an invisible, unprotected foundation for the entire business. He didn't ask me to take it. He knew better by then. But he told me the day he announced it that the role existed because of what he'd watched happen to me, and that he'd named it internally in his own notes, the Dana problem, as a permanent reminder of exactly what his father's restructuring had nearly destroyed. I didn't go back to Calloway Freight Solutions after my consulting engagement ended. I want to tell you that part honestly, because I think it matters. I didn't stay because some part of me, even after the apology, even after the fair terms, even after watching Richard Calloway visibly humbled in a conference room by numbers he could no longer argue with, understood that 12 years of being undervalued leaves a mark that a single good outcome doesn't erase. I took the consulting fee, which was substantial, and I took the experience, and I took the hardest lesson of my professional life, and I used all 3 of them to start something of my own. I run an operations consulting practice now, out of a small office I lease in town, helping small and mid-sized companies do exactly what Calloway Freight should have done for me years earlier. Document their institutional knowledge before a crisis forces them to learn its value the expensive way. I have 4 clients currently on retainer. I set my own rates. I write my own contracts, every single time, with my own attorney reviewing every line, because I will never again let the value of my work live undefined in someone else's head about me, instead of in writing protecting myself. The IT contractor whose warning had started all of this almost 2 years before I needed it, works with me now part-time. I hired him the month I opened my practice, and the first thing I told him, only half joking, was that I owed him more than he'd ever know, because his single piece of advice on an ordinary Tuesday had quietly built the floor I ended up standing on when everything else gave way. I still think about that morning in Richard's office sometimes, the cardboard box already packed by the time I walked in, my name written on it in someone else's handwriting. I think about the 4 words he used, a different direction, and how little he understood in that moment about how much direction actually depended on me. I don't think about it with bitterness anymore most days. I think about it the way you think about a storm you survived, with respect for how close it came, and with a kind of quiet pride that you're the one who built the shelter, even when nobody asked you to, even when nobody thanked you for it until they had no other choice. 12 years taught me that being indispensable and being valued are not the same thing, and that the difference between them only becomes visible the moment someone tries to replace you without ever having bothered to understand what you actually did. I don't regret the 12 years. I built real things in that time, things that mattered, things that, in their own quiet way, are still running today because I built them to last. What I regret is how long it took me to understand that protecting the value of my own work was never disloyalty. It was the most basic form of self-respect I could have practiced, and I'd simply never been taught to practice it until I had no other choice. If you've ever been the person holding everything together while someone else took the credit, I hope this reminded you of something important. Quietly protecting your own value isn't bitterness, and it isn't betrayal. It's the one thing nobody can ever fire you from. That's my story. 12 years, 1 cardboard box and a folder of my own that spoke louder than any apology ever could. If this reminded you that your work deserves to be valued honestly, take that as your sign tonight. Share this with someone who's ever been told they're the reason everything works, and then treated like they're replaceable anyway. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.